We're live. We are live. Great. Well, welcome to this edition of Let's Do Lunch, where you ask, we answer economic questions. And we, in this case, includes, I am very excited to say, the great Ernie Tedeschi. Ernie is a dear old friend of mine, but probably more important in terms of recent economic collaborations. He was the chief economist at the CEA when I was chairing the Council of Economic Advisors. And I love Ernie's work for a lot of reasons, not least of which is, the old adage about um, the surgery was a success, but the patient died. Um, the idea being that everybody's got their specialty, but nobody's looking at the big picture. Um, Ernie very much knows how the pieces fit together, and so I could go on, but Ernie, welcome. We got a lot of questions to get to, so I'm going to jump in.
Go for it. Thanks so much for having me, Jared.
My pleasure. I should say that Ernie is a key member and founder, even maybe, of the Budget Lab. Is that correct?
Not a founder,
Okay.
and probably not so, debatable how much of a key member I am. But for my sins, I'm doing mostly tariffs these days. So,
Well, all I know is that the Budget Lab is the cool kid on the block, and I know Ernie's playing a role there. Okay, we got a consumer price index report this morning, and it was a little warm in ways that looked tariffy to me and to Ernie, I think, as well. So I want to start, Ernie, with a question for you. We have numerous questions on inflation this morning from our viewers. I'm going to tick through them and then kick it to you. Overall, what's going on with inflation? Seems like we're starting to see some tariff pass through. What does that imply for consumers, for the inflation, the path of inflation for the Federal Reserve? Harry N says, how much inflation can the U.S. economy take until things start to break? Frankie D, can you please break down the latest CPI numbers? What does it mean for the average person? Let me just throw those at you, Ernie, and take it wherever you want.
yeah. So why don't we start at the very beginning? So the Federal Reserve, which you may have heard of, our central bank, has two jobs: maximum employment and price stability. Sometimes those jobs are in conflict with one another. Hopefully, they're not. Um, and they define price stability as an inflation rate of 2%. Now, to make this super confusing, we got CPI this morning. The Fed doesn't define their inflation mandate in terms of CPI. They define it in terms of a different price index that we're going to get at the end of the month called PCE. Luckily, a lot that we get in CPI goes into PCE, so there's a lot of overlap. But CPI tends to run a little bit hotter than PCE. So if we're aiming for 2% on PCE, we want to be at like 2.3%, usually 2.5% maybe on CPI. We're still higher than that now. We're higher than that. I know we're higher than that on PCE. Hold on. I'm actually checking where we are on core CPI right now. I just realized I didn't even look at
2.9% year over year.
Year over year. So that's very high for core CPI. We're still above target. Now, on a monthly basis, and Jared and I have used this line multiple times from CEA, you never want to focus too much on a particular month in CPI because the data is noisy. However, because everybody's kind of trying to dig in, open up the hood, look for tariffs, everybody is looking at the month-to-month data and just seeing if there's any sign there. Month-to-month came in at 0.23%. For core. That's a little that is also a little hot on a month-to-month basis. You want it at like 0.17%. And when you look at the excess, if you look at the difference between that 0.23 and that 0.17, it's mostly driven by core goods. That is goods other than food and energy. And that's probably a sign that tariffs are beginning to weigh in on individual product data. And you open up the hood some more and you look at specific products that we know are tariff sensitive, things like electronics, furniture, apparel this month. And they were pretty hot. Furniture, I think, was 1% thereabouts. Apparel had not been very hot recently, which was one of the mysteries of tariff pass through, but then it came in at 0.4% this month, which is higher than normal for apparel. So I think there's increasing evidence that tariffs are weighing on the
Yeah.
price data.
Let me amplify some of those points. I want to start where you left off. Tariffs and the price data. I'm just going to read three headlines from the Journal, Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. And I'm not saying that the media always gets this right, although I think they've actually done quite a good job on tariffs. But here are the three headlines from this morning. Inflation picks up as tariffs start to seep into prices. That's the Journal. The Times. U.S. inflation accelerated in June as Trump's tariffs push up prices. That's the Times. Uh, Washington Post. Inflation picked up in June as tariffs begin to lift prices across the economy. So it looks to me like something we've expected for a long time, and I've talked a lot about on Let's Do Lunch, which is that the very large amount of revenues that our Customs and Border Patrol agents are picking up now from the tariffs, even though there's all this back and forth on whether the tariffs are going to stick or not. Ernie will know the exact average effective tariff rate right now, but it's in the mid-teens, probably 16%, 17%. That's the highest since the 1930s. So that's in place. And we're collecting 4 or 5 times per month what we used to at the border as an import tax, and that has to come out somewhere. And one of the places it's start 1 month, don't over torque, et cetera, is as we've said. That's of great concern because I think, again, it's my prediction, not Ernie's. I think we're seeing the tip of the spear in terms of consumer pass-through on tariffs, and I think we're going to see more of it. That's problematic for consumers, means higher prices. It also means the Fed may have issues on when to cut rates. Ernie, did you want to add anything to that before I get to the next question?
I agree with all of that. Just a couple of points. One, I think I would expect more tariff impact on prices in July and August. One part of the question was, how does this impact normal people? And if you think that the most tariff sensitive sectors are things like apparel and electronics, that could potentially really impact back to school shopping at the end of the summer. So that you may
Mhm.
start seeing tariffs bite around that point. A second thing, though, and I'll end here, what I would emphasize is the uncertainty about how exactly this is going to work its way through the economy. So yes, we're seeing evidence of some price increases as a result of tariffs. Tariffs may not be fully passed through to consumers. Businesses may eat some of the tariffs in the form of lower profits. That's not, a win for the economy, however.
Mm.
Even, if consumers don't see the full amount of the tariffs and businesses eat some of them, that still means that businesses hire less, invest less than they did. There are long run productivity and wage growth effects as a result of that. So, like, we don't dodge a bullet, if tariff pass through doesn't end up being 100% of the tariff. Um, and like both Jared and I were saying before, this is not like COVID where you wake up and suddenly it's just a precipitously different economy from when you went to bed the night before. It takes time for all of this with tariffs to work its way through the economy. And so we need to be patient.
Okay, we're going to, let's see. Helen P asks, let's stick with tariffs trade war. Why would other countries not just write off the US market and just trade amongst themselves? It's a good question. Ernie, you want to try to take that? You can always say, no thanks, but what do you think?
Why did I go second, Jared? I know.
Okay. Um, the US is one of the largest markets in the world. We're the largest economy. We consume a larger share of our GDP than any other advanced economy by a long shot. Ours is close to 70%. Europe is around 55. China's around 45. So our American consumers are an acquisitive bunch. I can speak from personal experience. And so other countries can't easily write us off. They need our consumers to help buy their exports. However, Helen P has a point, especially when you make a trade agreement, as has happened with Korea, as has happened with Canada and Mexico, uh, and Japan, and President Trump ignores that agreement. that's certainly going to make countries wary about trade arrangements with us, and that and yes, countries will look for other outlets for their exports. Europe has looked more favorably on China in that regard than I think we have. And those kinds of rearrangements are occurring as we speak. But you can't write off the US consumer market. No country can reasonably do that. And when Trump says we have the cards, that's one of his favorite lines. What he's saying is that for many of these countries, Canada is a great example, we buy way more from them than they buy for us. So there is some dependency there. Ernie, you want to add anything?
No, I completely agree with that. Look, the United States is, depending on how you measure it, the first or second largest economy in the world, depending on what you do with purchasing power there. Um, we are an economic force, period. End of story. I think that the risk is that the more uh, you know, uh, the more poorly founded we seem on trade agreements and keeping our word on things, and the more chaotic we seem on our trade policy, the bigger the risk that other countries start building supply chains that go around us. Essentially, there will always be countries that want to sell to us. Again, we're such a large economy, such a rich economy. Like, we're not talking about the United States suddenly being isolated in an absolute sense, or poor in an absolute sense. The United States will always be a rich country. However, what we are talking about is going forward gradually over time, the potential that countries realign themselves, both economically and possibly even politically and militarily, um, and that the United States has less influence over time. And that's important to the extent that we hold our values dear, both our economic values, our political values. Um, it is important to us that we have influence throughout the world. And so if that wanes, that's damaging to America.
Yeah, I think it's actually important on various levels, on economic levels, on geopolitical levels, on kind of human ethical levels, to play nice with others. Not everybody. In other words, there are unfair trading practices and obviously bad regimes. But the question also made me think of another point that's adjacent to it, which is one way in which countries try to get around these tariffs and continue to trade with us is through transshipments, meaning
Right.
that, like, take China. China faces a very high tariff rate from us. So it says, hey, Vietnam, will you do me a favor and export this good from China through Vietnam into your country? And I mean, they don't literally say that, but that's sort of how it works. And one of the things that the Trump administration is trying to do is to shut down those transshipments, to get much stricter and apply a higher tariff rate. So the Vietnam trade framework includes a 20% tariff on direct exports from Vietnam to the US, a 40% tariff on transshipment. So that's a way of trying to shut down this backdoor technique. One more question on trade for now, because I thought this was a good one. This came up on my Substack, and I said I'd get to it here. Uh, do you believe that reducing the trade deficit is a worthwhile policy goal? So obviously, Team Trump has said we want to really take down the trade deficit. We can talk about whether tariffs get you there. I kind of don't think they do. But let's just talk about this idea. Is reducing this questioner said the current account deficit? That's just a fancy way, really, of saying the trade deficit. Is that a worthwhile policy goal? Ernie, you start.
My take is that there are good reasons to have a current account deficit and bad reasons to have a current account deficit. And the flip side is true of current account surpluses as well. So, for example, if you looked at African countries that were being strip mined for diamonds by European colonial superpowers, those African countries all ran trade surpluses, I guarantee you, because they were shipping out diamonds and they were not importing much in the way of consumer goods. That is a bad situation for those countries, right?
By
I
the
think
way,
we
you
would
you
all.
happen to be answering a question that somebody just asked, which is, well, what
Oh,
about
amazing.
what about what people are actually trading? So go ahead.
There you go. So if you were judging that arrangement purely by the current account deficit or the trade, surplus, that would be masking an unsustainable economic situation, not to mention a morally horrendous situation. And the flip side is that not all current account deficits are bad. So let's pretend that you're a country, illustratively, let's say the United States, that is on the forefront of a new technology. Let's say artificial intelligence. And everybody in the world wants to invest in your country. If there is for, foreign direct investment into your country, Germans, Japanese investors, Indonesian investors, all sending money to you because they want to be part of your economic growth, shows up in the form of trade deficits and current account deficits. Those are not bad things necessarily. They could manifest as bad things from certain other criteria if, say, foreigners are buying up strategic assets that we don't want to let go control of. But like investment in American innovation and businesses is good, right? Like it helps us grow more. It helps us do more with what we have. We should encourage that. So that's another way where a current account deficit would lead you astray in assessing the situation. I guess where I come down is two things. One is there are certainly non-economic criteria or non-economic priorities that we might have that might lead us to want to reduce current account deficits in certain sectors or with certain countries. I'm not saying I agree with this, but you have heard it argued that we should have more civilian shipbuilding capacity in the United States. And I think that the best version of that argument is that we want more civilian shipbuilding capacity because in the event of a military conflict, we want to be able to ramp up production of military naval vessels if necessary. Again, I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but that's an example of like a non-economic criteria being applied to, the balance of manufacturing, a trade deficit that we might have with other countries. The last thing I'll say is that if you do think that a trade deficit is a bad thing, the easiest way to reduce the trade deficit is to close the budget deficit every year. Because when we have to sell our bonds worldwide to other investors to fund our deficit, that increases our current account deficit. So, putting everything else I said aside about the efficacy of looking at the current account deficit, if you think it's a bad thing, then you should be in favor of reducing our federal deficits
Well,
too.
now hold on a second, Ernie.
Pretty
I mean,
substantial.
hold on a second here. If you're the government and the Trump and the Republicans and you want to lower trade deficit and you just passed a budget bill that's going to send the deficit through the roof, it seems like you're working at loggerheads. That's all
That's
rhetorical.
that's called an oops, Jared.
Yeah. Um, so, two questions have come across the transom related to this. When are tariffs good, and has free trade been beneficial for people, especially those in poverty? Um, I'll get to those. I want to. Ernie did such a thorough answering of that question. He left me, which is a good thing, very little to add. One thing I will add, though, is that persistent trade deficits have been problematic for certain communities wherein they've been concentrated. There's a literature in economics called the China shock, and it focuses on how import penetration from China has really hurt persistently communities that have lost factory employment. But the nuances that Ernie I'm underscored are all correct. When are tariffs good? Um, so I mean, I think the problem with Trump tariffs is that they're so sweeping. They're just so indiscriminate, and then tariffs on islands filled with penguins, like that's just kind of nuts. So, but that I'm joking there, but I'm talking you start going 20, 30, 40% on the EU and on countries Canada, Mexico, Japan, our allies, Vietnam, a country with whom we've engaged in free trade for for a while. That's bad. That invokes, in my view, that invokes um, real damage to the international trading system. Targeted tariffs are a useful tool. You're talking about, I always use this example because I was one I worked on once. Rubber tires, grade 4, or what defines this particular chicken part. That kind of tariff can actually prevent unfair dumping, where countries try to grab market share by selling some product or good under price. And that's great use of tariffs. So tariffs are a scalpel, but they're being used as a sledgehammer, and that's a problem. Has trade been beneficial? We could spend an hour on that question. Yes, broadly speaking, it has certainly increased the economy's supply capacity, and that's helped in lots of different ways. I think it helps with prices. I think it helps with productivity. But as I mentioned earlier, there are folks who have been hurt by persistent trade imbalance, and not a little hurt, but a lot hurt. And I think the failure of many in the political class to come to grips with the downsides of globalization helps explain some of the challenging, to say the least, that's a euphemism, politics we face today. Um, okay, we're going to move into an area that Ernie and I love to talk about, which Ernie already referenced, which is fiscal policy, budgets, constraints in that space. And I know you've done a lot of work on that. Gregory A. asks an important question. Is it possible for Social Security to run out of money? What happens then? I've got thoughts, but Ernie, you start.
So the way that we've set it up, yes. Well, it's possible for Social Security to not have enough revenue coming in to pay out current benefits. And so when you read the news and you see projections from the Social Security trustees for when insolvency is going to happen with Social Security, that means that's when, so there's currently a trust fund for Social Security. And for a while, we were running Social Security surpluses, meaning that we were collecting more in FICA taxes and payroll taxes than necessary to pay out. And so all that extra bit, we were literally saving it in the trust fund. Um, Now we're running persistent deficits. We can run deficits for a little while because we have those trust fund savings. But what the Social Security trustees say is that come, I think 2035 is now the latest, or it might be 2034 are the latest years. That trust fund will run out of money. Now we're always going to have money coming in because we're always going to have workers. So, people that tell you that Social Security won't be there or Social Security won't pay out money are wrong. Social Security will be able to pay out most benefits, but you'll probably, but in order to align payouts with the revenues coming in 2034 or 2035, you would probably need a roughly 20%, I think now, across the board cut to benefits, which is devastating, especially if you're a current beneficiary then. So that's the problem right there. It's not that like Social Security is going away. It's that you might lose a fifth of your benefits if Congress doesn't fix this problem.
Yeah. So exactly right. And my answer, which you got to, is it possible for Social Security to run out of money? The answer is no, as long as we have workers, which is what Ernie said. It's possible for the trust fund to be exhausted in exactly the way Ernie described. That's a 23% cut in benefits, which I would consider devastating.
Yeah.
It's important, as Ernie said, I think it was his word, but it is important to correct this misimpression that some people say, well, when the trust fund runs out, no more Social Security, the benefits go to zero. That's obviously completely inaccurate. And so, 77% would still be intact, and that would be a devastating cut. There was a question, what's the Social Security impact of the big ugly bill? Well, somebody wrote the big, that wasn't its title, but that I would consider that an apt title. The It actually pulled forward that expiration, that period that Ernie just mentioned by a year. I think it took it from 2033 to 2032. And the reason is because it shielded some income by giving a tax cut to elderly people that otherwise would have been taxed into Social Security. And so that's a reason why you got that pushes things the wrong way in terms of that window. Um, Okay, let me see. Um, we have time for two more questions if we play our cards right. Jack B asks, is the public service loan forgiveness program going away? So now we're moving into student loan territory, which is always understandably popular and germane up here. Oh, by the way, I'm sorry. Quick, a number of people said something we talked about recently. I think it was with our old friend Elena Patel last week, who was at the CEA when we were, about one way we could help extend Social Security's solvency, and that would be to lift the cap, to extend the cap. So Social Security payroll taxes go up to 176,000 in salary. Once you make a dollar above that, it's untaxed. That because of the increase in earnings inequality, there's a bigger chunk of earnings sitting above that cap than there used to be. So an upward adjustment in the cap would both help address some of the pressures from increased inequality and loosen some solvency constraints there. I think that would be a good policy. Ernie, quickly, are you on board with that?
Yeah, I'm 100% on board with that. I think the policy that makes the most sense is to insure more wages, because essentially the cap is the amount of your wages that are being insured by Social Security. And we've just, because of rising inequality over time, that cap hasn't kept pace with the same proportion of income. There's just more and more labor income um, bunched at the top that is being uninsured and untaxed. So I think one good solution would be to raise that cap, insure more of that income.
What
That's
if
not going to be
we
enough to solve the entire
No,
problem, but
no, good
you
point.
know,
What if we raised the cap and indexed it so it always captured the same share?
yeah, like 90% or
Yeah.
whatever people talk about. Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Okay,
Um,
so vote for Ernie for president and he'll do that.
no, bad for the Republic.
Getting back to this public loan forgiveness question from Jack B, Trump said, so basically, is the public loan forgiveness program going away? And this is a program wherein if you take a job under certain sectors in the public, for the public good, teacher, firefighter, cop, that kind of thing, you can have your student loan retired sooner. And there was an executive order to this effect that I was going to read if a part of it if I had time because this is from the Trump administration. It's downright weird. You should go and find it. It starts getting into terrorism and human trafficking in ways that are very strange. But PSLF does continue to exist. What I wanted to use this for, it has been like these other student loan components, it's been tightened. And that's what I wanted to talk a little bit about here, the impact of the big budget bill on student loan programs. So repayment plans have been significantly changed and reduced. The SAVE plan, which was one under the Biden administration that we thought was particularly kind of helpful to people trying to pay back student loans, has been canceled. There's close to 8 million people in that, and they will start paying interest on their debt starting in August if they don't get into another plan. It's been replaced by two plans, a standard repayment plan and an income-driven repayment plan. And I think it's called the Repayment Assistance Plan, or RAP. And I actually think it's good to have just two, because the other thing was kind of, there were so many choices. But anyway, Pell Grants have been tightened in terms of eligibility. There have been lower borrowing caps. And the punchline is the New York Times put in a very nice graphic that you can find called Average Monthly Student Loan Payments, how they've changed under the budget, show considerably higher costs. So just give you one example. For families in the 60 to 70,000 range, their average student loan payments under the new budget bill would more than double from $145 a month to $350 a month. So I just wanted to give that rundown. Ernie, is there anything you want to add, or should we try to jam one more question in here?
While we move on to another question.
Okay. Is the housing, here's a big one. Is the housing market really as bad as people say it is? I feel like I see, this is from Grace K. I feel like I see new apartments building every month, but folks still can't afford the rent. What's going on? And if you can say anything about shelter prices in there, go ahead.
Yeah. So we had um, several years of very high rent inflation. And that was, Jared will know this. In our days at CEA, this was a particular thorn in our side when it came to inflation because there were lots of components of CPI and PCE that we were talking about earlier, on the goods and the services side that were, pretty normal or even weak, but rent inflation was persistently above normal. And, um, that really affected monetary policy, I think, made the Fed more willing to raise rates and to keep rates high as a result of that. And it was frustrating. Not what the Fed was doing, but just the fact that that was the data coming in and it was so persistent. We've seen rent inflation come down, cool down now, to levels that are much more in line with pre-pandemic. So on the one hand, that's good. On the other hand, and this was a dynamic that was true when Jared and I were at CEA too, rent inflation in CPI and PCE is a lagged indicator. It takes when you see market rents with apartments that you see on apartmentlist.com or Zillow or wherever go up or down, like it takes like a year for that to seep into the official price data. And that's not anything that BLS is doing wrong. The Bureau of Labor Statistics that presents computes CPI. It just has to do with the way that that contracts are in housing and the fact that they don't update very often, and so it takes a while for these market changes to get in there. Um, uh, all of that said, too, I think that there is still, despite the headlines that you hear about more construction happening in certain cities, California easing certain environmental regulations to build more, we still just have this persistent housing shortage in America that predates Trump, predates Biden. It goes back a while, and it's going to take um, a lot of different policy. There's no silver bullet policy that solves that. It's going to take a lot, and I think most frustratingly too, for people like Jared and I who worked in the federal government, it's going to take a lot of new policy at the local level where there aren't a lot of federal levers, to apply.
Zoning is obviously land use
Yeah,
policy. Yeah. Well,
density.
look,
Yeah, exactly.
we're at time now, but I really like how efficiently you took us through that. What I'd like to do is start next time with this question. Ernie won't be here next time, but he will be back, whether he wants to or not, because he did such a great job, and he's such a great explainer of this work. I will say that even as rental inflation normalizes, let's keep in mind the difference between price levels and inflation. Lower inflation just means prices are growing more slowly. It doesn't mean the rent's coming down. And there's a lot of people out there working their butts off to try to make rent, which remains quite elevated relative to incomes. We see real pressures there. And one of the things I spend a lot of time thinking about and working on is more affordable housing. Exciting new paper out on that from a couple of folks. Maybe I'll be able to get one of them on next week or in coming weeks to talk in greater detail about this. But for now, thank you to Ernie. Thanks for sharing your knowledge with us. I know you're very busy. Like I said, I'm going to grab you back here. And thanks to our listeners. We had 1,500 folks here today, and that's a great number. So we'll see you next week on Let's Do Lunch. Bye bye, everybody.
Bye.